Fighting games, who doesn't love them? Whether you're looking for something casual, competitive, or a bit in between, there are plenty of high quality titles out there for anyone to enjoy. You know, I've always been fascinated by the handheld entries that you used to see come out of this genre before the hardware truly caught up to home console standards like how it is nowadays. The 3DS is a particularly unique machine when it comes to fighting games. Since sure, it was never going to be the device that hardcore players would use at EVO, and yes, developers would have to compromise with its form factor as well as its technical limitations. But that never stopped them from at the very least attempting to bring these beloved series over into this console's ecosystem. This system received a surprising amount of fighting titles back in the day. I still have some fond memories even playing some of these games on those demo units you used to see all the time at shopping centres. Which is why today, let's take a look back at a number of unique fighting games that came out on the 3DS to find out if they're even worth going back to in the modern day and whether or not they stood the test of time. In retrospect, it's a bit strange how much flack the launch lineup for the 3DS received back when it came out. Sure, the system didn't release alongside the new Mario or Zelda game, but there was plenty of third-party offerings on the console that gave early adopters something to do. One such title was the technically impressive Super Street Fighter 4 3D, which was a port of the then current version of Street Fighter 4 that came out on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. This edition includes a huge roster of 35 playable characters and even runs at 60 frames per second when not in 3D. There's a few compromises made to achieve this, like the fighters being less detailed and stage environments not having any animation, but in a fighting game, consistent performance is what's most important, so it's a worthy trade-off. A series like Street Fighter to me really feels at home on a handheld once you're comfortable with its controls. It's the perfect game to play in short bursts on the go, and it's one of the few titles out there that feels like it respects the player's time, since a typical match will only run you no more than 3 minutes. But you know what's most impressive about this port? The full colour instruction manual they include with the game. It features inputs for every character and really breaks down its mechanics for newcomers. This has to be the last time a game manual like this was ever made. Anyway, moving back on track, some new features of this version is how you can use the bottom screen for quick inputs that require no execution, which as you can expect is more intended for casual use, since it is pretty busted, but no one was ever going to play this version competitively anyway. This game also supported download play, remember that? It is locked into playing as just Ryu, but I mean with the right person back in the day, I'm sure this is something you could easily pour hours into if you're both on the same skill level. There's also this bizarre 3D mode which adds a more cinematic camera angle that reminds me of Tekken and doesn't feel right for a game like this. It's just disorientating. On top of that, you also have the series staple arcade mode, but its story campaign didn't make the cut on 3DS, which is a bit of a knock to the game's overall score, since we'll be seeing later on in this video that this wasn't a problem for other developers to implement on this system. Super Street Fighter 4 3D isn't an easy recommendation today, but back when it released it was stellar, but a few years later the game would receive its final update with Ultra, which added in more characters and content. Not to mention, if you really are craving some Street Fighter 4 on the go nowadays, there's the Steam Deck that can run Ultra and still has its online servers up. So in all honesty, outside of its novelty and cheap price tag, I wouldn't say it's worth going back to 3D nowadays, since there are just way better alternatives out there. But you know what fighting game is worth taking a second look at, or third, get it because 3D, Dead or Alive Dimensions. Now, I wasn't really familiar with this long running series before playing it for the purposes of this video, but I've gotta say this entry has more than impressed me. It's a title that's very much designed for newcomers, which makes sense when you realise it was the first time Dead or Alive ever came to a Nintendo console. And unlike Street Fighter 4, the game actually included a story mode which acts as a best-of compilation that chronicles events from the previous entries, which is a great way of bringing new fans up to date with this series' lore and characters. The story mode also features tutorial sections which are impressive, with it covering every mechanic of the game. Personally, I've always had a hard time adjusting to 3D fighters, so this was something I appreciated. Its cutscenes feature a mix of these still diorama shots which look a little strange, but it does feature actual animation. And there's also some CGI cutscenes which are taken from previous entries, and as you'd expect they look very compressed on the 3DS's small screen. This is a good mode all things considered, it's entertaining enough. I know most fighting game players don't really care for this kind of stuff, but I found Dead or Alive Dimensions to be the perfect blend of a casual and hardcore fighter. This game really was a solid package back in the day that featured a plethora of modes like arcade, survival and challenges, with you being rewarded with characters and skins for completing them. Remember when skins weren't just overpriced microtransactions and actually had you play the game to unlock them? Dead or Alive Dimensions' roster at the time of its release was also the biggest in this series. You do have to unlock a lot of its characters, which may be a negative to some, but personally I like when games do this. I find that it incentivizes the player to really try out what's on offer. As for how this game feels, it runs at an incredibly smooth 60 frames per second, and I like how combat is based on juggling your opponent. By stringing together different punches and kicks in high and low sequences, you can eventually break through other combatants' defenses. This is already fun, but to keep things interesting, you can perform what the game calls holds, which are pretty much counters, and this mechanic quickly changes things up with it rewarding players for acting defensively. Which is a dynamic I personally find a lot of other fighters struggle with. Sometimes you're just standing there holding block for what feels like an eternity until it's your turn. But this simple technique solves that issue, allowing players to quickly flip the flow of battle at any moment. Similar to Street Fighter 4 3D, there are entire combos that you can import with one tap of the bottom screen, which is a smart way to learn these pretty lengthy move techniques and helps bridge the gap for casuals getting to grips with Dead or Alive's basics. Also, check it out, there's Ridley as a stage hazard. Team Ninja also made Other so it's cool of them to include this as a nod to that somewhat overhated game. In all honesty, I really can't help but sing the praises of this title. It's solid all around, it still looks amazing today with its vibrant colours and detailed character models. I recently just picked up the 5th game after enjoying this one on the cheap, which really should be a testament to its quality. I can't recommend it enough, even just for its single player offerings alone. Our next fighter is one that went under my radar back when it came out, which is the oddly titled BlazBlue Continuum Shift 2. This somewhat underrated game released with all the content from its arcade and home console counterparts, with the only compromise with this port being its noticeable lowered resolution, especially when it comes to character sprites. It's a really faithful port on the machine, which is great since this fighter is still a ton of fun even today. Where BlazBlue stands out from its other conventional peers is with its sense of humour and how it features a pretty beefy story mode that's set as a visual novel, which is also fully voice acted with an amazing English dub. It has a ton of joke endings which can act as borderline parodies at times. As for its gameplay, this footage may be a bit misleading since despite its tone, BlazBlue as a series is known for having a pretty brutal difficulty curve. One trip down to arcade mode will more than prove this for casual players. Like for instance, there's Elliot-Cloud who's a zoner on the surface, but she can also control gravity with the wind's direction that can send you flying all around the place, which also affects projectiles. You also have Valkenhayn who can transform into a werewolf, complete with its own moveset. There's so much diversity in the character roster for BlazBlue, everyone plays a bit differently. It's very much overwhelming for beginners, and in all honesty, I could easily go on for hours about how distinct each of these characters feel to play. I mean, if you can tolerate this version's inferior resolution, you can't really go wrong with this port, even today. Whilst there is better alternatives out there even for handheld players, you still can't go wrong with this one. Up next is an installment that in all honesty is pretty lackluster, with Namco's attempt at bringing the Tekken series over to the 3DS with Tekken 3D Prime Edition. Like with Dead or Alive, I'm pretty much a newcomer to this series outside of playing Tekken at friends' houses and arcades growing up. Starting off with its positives, it is somewhat impressive how they managed to cram a full-length movie and a game into a small 3DS cartridge. The film that's bundled together, known as Blood Egg, isn't a bad movie, but I was hoping as someone new to this franchise that it would better introduce the world of Tekken since a lot of it went over my head. It would have also been nice if they sprinkled in some actual battles like with other fighting game story modes, since I prefer that opposed to sitting down and just watching everything play out. And let's be honest for a moment, if you really want to watch this movie today, there's no way you're gonna view it on a small compressed 3DS screen. But this isn't a movie review, so onto the actual game part of this package, and well, it's pretty disappointing. Why on earth did they release this game with no arcade mode? There's this survival mode which feels really foamed in, and even as a beginner, these CPUs are way too easy. Even when I cranked up the game's difficulty, they were still a pushover. This survival mode is laughable, you can beat it in less than 5 minutes and that's pretty much the entire game. It did have online functionality back in the day, but that's gone, and what baffles me is how there's no option to play a standard 2-set match against a CPU. How do you mess the bare minimum up? Even Street Fighter V at launch at the very least had this. The menus do show quick battle, but this isn't what you think it is. It's pretty much survival mode again, except with 2 rounds instead of 1. From what I can gather online, this game is just a stripped down version of Tekken 6, which had a much better handheld conversion on the PSP. So this edition got showed up by a handheld release from the previous generation that was on weaker hardware. Now that's kinda messed up. I guess some positives I can try to say about this game is that its roster is of a decent size, but why bother when there's nothing to actually do with these characters? The game also runs in 3D at 60 frames per second, which if you really care is a step up compared to Street Fighter 4 and DOA, but I'm not really a fan of these visuals. All the character models look like they were dipped in grease with how shiny they are. The game is just inexcusable. They had a chance to bring newcomers into this series and it fails on that front from its major lack of modes. Dead or Alive Dimensions proved that you can make an amazing content-rich fighter on the system using assets from its home console counterparts at the time, so there really is no excuse for Tekken 3D Prime Edition being this bad. To further put things into perspective, I blew through all this game's content in just 15 minutes and got bored of it immediately, so yeah, I can't say this one's worth going back to in any ways nowadays, which is a shame since I really wanted to like it. For our final fighter today, what could be a more fitting option than Nintendo's very own Super Smash Bros. For 3DS? Now I still vividly remember being so hyped for this one. It was a dual release on both the 3DS and Wii U, with it coming out first on the handheld. There was even a pre-release demo that I remember playing religiously before it dropped back in 2014. Coming back to Smash 4 today is interesting. Visually, I've always liked the 3DS's look more than the Wii U's. The developers knew to go for a more vibrant aesthetic since the pseudo-realism of Brawl on Wii U with all its clothing and hair textures couldn't be done on the system. And in some cases, the visuals they went with here is aged better than the Wii U, specifically when set to higher resolutions, they really do pop out. This version of Smash had some modes unique to it that have still not been seen today. Of course, there's still Classic mode, which is a serious mainstay and is still a fun little casual experience. Smash 3DS did receive some flack back when it released for how it butchered Target Smash, with it instead being a glorified home run contest that is a poor man's equivalent to Angry Birds of all things. I mean, maybe they just couldn't get the rights? Then there's of course Smash Run, a mode exclusive to this installment. Sadly there was never any online, but it's pretty much a roguelike experience set in a similar vein to Air Ride City Trial, where you run around gathering stat upgrades or as random events occur. It also acted as a nice opportunity to represent other game series with its different enemies and was a nice reminder of Brawl Subspace Emissary, you know, the best single player campaign of any fighting game ever made. But unfortunately today, this mode hasn't aged all that well. My main gripe with it is how Smash 4 really obsessed over custom moves, and in all honesty, I was never really a fan of them. They always felt cheap to get hit by and were a pain to unlock. Smash Run has this fun concept of you running around gathering upgrades, but unlike its inspiration, City Trial, which had tons of different stadium events at the end of a round that gave the mode substance and replay value, all that Smash Run really boils down to at the end of a session is that same free-for-all gameplay that you can get anywhere else in this series. It also doesn't help that Smash 4 in general is the worst feeling game to play out of all of them. Sure, Brawl got hate for its tripping and floatiness, but Wii U and 3DS has some of the slowest attack moves I've ever seen in a fighter. It takes ages to knock an opponent into the blast zone, and not to mention aerial attacks just feel awful in this entry, with the final nail in its coffin being its awful meta that really ruined this entry for a lot of people, myself included. But with all that being said, Smash Run is still way better than World of Light's entire campaign mode, but you still can't really top Smash Ultimate as a whole. It includes every character with a phenomenal roster and feels much better to play, not to mention it's handheld with its online servers still available. Plus it doesn't require people to own the same game in order to play together like with the 3DS. Smash 4 is an interesting footnote in this series' history, but in retrospect it really did work so that Ultimate could run. And man did that game run. This title's not aged particularly well today, but it's the most fleshed out fighter on the system and has plenty of content and replay value. It's just that, you know, Ultimate is way better, so TLDR, just play that instead. But I mean, Smash Front is an entertaining enough experiment that's worth taking a look at if you're a die-hard fan of this series. What's strange about the 3DS looking back when it came to these types of games is just how willing developers were to release their iconic fighting titles on the system. The console had offerings from Dead or Alive and even Tekken, which still to this day are franchises that have never made their way onto the Switch. The machine might not be as well known to die-hard fans of the genre when compared to the original Xbox or even with its competitor, the PlayStation Vita, but there is still some gold to be found in the 3DS's fighting game library that can easily be enjoyed casually even today. Now, with all that being said, I'm curious, do you have any favourite fighters from this charming system's history? Feel free to tell me about it in the comments. As always, any feedback on this video is appreciated. Thank you so much for watching and I hope you have a nice rest of your day.